Hello. It's been a while, but despite the continuing pandemic being sort of difficult for motivation, I would like to at least finish up doing all of the adversaries and scenarios and stuff like that that's in the Spirit Island game right now at some point. And in the meantime, we've got a new expansion out, which not new to the tabletop, but new to this, which I did pick up, which contains two new spirits, Heart of the Wildfire and Serpent slumbering beneath the island. So, in the hopes of getting back into doing these things, I'm going to talk a little bit about these two spirits today, and then I'm going to jam out some games to try to remind myself how to play, and then hopefully try to I'll probably get a game in with one or both of them to show them off, stuff like that. I do like both of these spirits, and I think they're a great addition to the game. I really hope we get the first full tabletop expansion, Branch and Claw, at some point, because that adds the event system, which I think is a really big improvement to the game in terms of sort of unpredictability and, yeah, just good, as well as more content. And then, of course, over the holiday, I actually got a chance to try out the newest expansion, Jagged Earth. Well, let's be honest, we have tons of chances. It's a pandemic, there's nothing happening, but I actually did it, which has just tons and tons of new spirits in it, many of which are very cool, some of which I can't figure out at all, but that's fine. So hopefully some of those will come too, but in the meantime, we still have a lot of good stuff I'd like to get through, so I'm going to try to get back to it. No promises about as quick updates as before, just because of how things are, but it is what it is. Okay, so let's start with Heart of the Wildfire. Heart of the Wildfire is a... Can I not see the other side on this one? Huh, interesting. Well, wait, no. Oh, I see. It's just... Yeah, there we go. Yeah, it's listed as high complexity, basically full offense. Little bit of control, little bit of fear. Seems about right to me. Heart of the Wildfire has a very interesting gimmick where it is very dangerous to the land, and so it tends to hand out a bunch of blight, which obviously is going to be a sort of a love it or hate it type situation. I will say that generally, I find that this is a reasonably powerful spirit, and the blight it spreads is generally worth it. The downside is that makes it really problematic for some spirits, especially some of the expansion spirits, which have difficulty expanding into blighted lands. I don't think any of those are in this game yet, but it's worth remembering in the future, or if you play tabletop, that there are some spirits that just really do not get along with Heart of the Wildfire. The one I'm forgetting the name of from Branch and Claw that puts down a bunch of wilderness tokens is one good example. Also the Claw one from Branch and Claw. Both of those have a lot of trouble expanding into blighted lands. And of course, some powers and things have trouble targeting into blighted lands. That gets awkward. The other problem is that currently, both of the Blighted Island effects that you can get in this version of the game, again, the tabletop has more, but right now both of the Blighted Island effects you can get in this version of the game are annoying, which means that if Heart of the Wildfire is involved in your game, you're going to get to Blighted Island. It's going to be very difficult to avoid. So you're going to have to deal with that. And that means that the spirits that have trouble dealing with those Blighted Island effects become difficult to play with Heart of the Wildfire unless you've got something else canceling out the problems. In particular, both of the Blighted Island effects that you get in this version of the game destroy presence. And that can really cause a death spiral for spirits that have trouble deploying a lot of presence onto the board. So you want to be aware of that if you're picking people to play with Heart of the Wildfire. That said, it's a unique spirit that has a cool play style and is fun to try out, and if you play it with spirits that work well with it, or even just sort of can roughly ignore its shenanigans, then it can be very good. So let's take a quick look at what's going on. The special rules: Blazing Presence. After you add or move presence after setup, so not your initial stuff, in the land it goes to, for each fire element showing on your tracks, do 1 damage. If 2 or more fire elements are showing on your tracks, add a blight. Push any number of Dahan. And this only happens once, no matter how many presents you add at the same time. So this is a sort of an awkward ability. Now, it does combine with Destructive Nature, which is blight added due to spirit effects, power, special rules, scenario-based rituals, etc. does not destroy your presence, including cascades. So at least you don't have the problem where you have 2 fire showing, you add a blight to the land, you just put your presence in and immediately destroy your presence and feel like an idiot. That doesn't happen. That said, obviously this gets pretty seriously out of control pretty quickly, just in terms of putting pressure on your blight. The good news, of course, is that if 2 or more are showing on your tracks, you also get to destroy a village, assuming the village doesn't have extra health or other shenanigans, whatever, which is quite good. So, as we can see from here, this only counts fire showing on your tracks. It doesn't count your cards, so it's completely under your control when you start getting the 2-1. The 1-1 is obviously just... The 1 fire version is obviously just straight great bonus. You throw down a presence in a land with just an explorer. It takes out the explorer. I am always a big fan of take out explorers for free. That's just phenomenal. So, and you're going to get that basically on your first growth, because you can't grow without revealing a fire. So, the nice thing is, the very first presence you place in the game will take out an explorer. That's awesome. It does mean you have to be pretty careful about where you start moving up your tracks, because once you've gotten to stage 2 on both tracks, now you've got the issue where you're going to add blight to the land you grow into every time you grow, which gets a little bit questionable. Push any number of Dahan is also nice. I believe you do this in the order written. So unfortunately, if you have 2 or more fire showing and you put a presence somewhere with a Thunder Speaker presence and some Dahan, and you push the Dahan out, the Thunder Speaker presence will die to the blight before the Dahan get moved, which is a bummer. I'm not 100% sure on that, but maybe I'll boot it up at the end and check if I remember. But I don't know why you would do it in any order other than the order written, so I can't imagine why it wouldn't do that. So that's too bad. You want to make sure not to mess with Thunder Speaker. Thunder Speaker is still a pretty good person to play with this spirit, just because Thunder Speaker can get the heck out of the way by moving with the Dahan, and so has sort of an inherent ability to resist their presence being set on fire. This, in combination with going into Blighted Island, is what makes Heart of the Wildfire so potentially dangerous to its friends, especially in this version of the game, because again, thus far, we only have Blighted Island cards that are dangerous for presence, and this is dangerous for your friend's presence, so you can really... There's a risk that you're just going to remove all your friend's presence from the island accidentally and kill them, which you do not want to do, obviously, since then you lose. Excuse me. So the first consideration we're going to have is we want to be really careful about unlocking the second fire too early. The good news is we can get up to potentially 3 card plays before we unlock any fire, a second fire. The bad news is we can only get 3 total growths before we get the second fire, and we might not even want to do that. The further bad news is we get no energy income from our tracks with that, although if we look up at our growth options, we have add presence, gain a bunch of energy here. This is going to be your bread and butter growth option anyway. Now, again, this gives you +1 energy per fire showing, but because you do growth before you have a chance to play powers, this is only ever going to count whatever's on your track. On the other hand, that means this is worst case scenario presence in 3 energy, and eventually it'll be, or even pretty quickly if you want to, it will be presence in 4 energy or so forth. The other thing you'll notice that's sort of problematic about these growth tracks is you don't have a growth option that grows twice. You don't have any way to get your second card play without growing twice, so you're not going to be able to play 2 cards on the first turn, which is always a bummer. I always really enjoy being able to play 2 cards on the first turn. Obviously, this is somewhat mitigated by the fact that you get to do your Blazing Presence trigger when you place your presence on the first turn, and on the first turn, taking out a lone explorer is an incredibly powerful ability, right? If I'm playing Lightning Swift Strike, I'm often quite happy paying 3 energy in a card play to get rid of a single explorer. Well, this costs 0 energy and doesn't cost your card play. Obviously significantly better. You're also pretty likely to be able to trigger Firestorm on turn 1. It does have to target a land with Blight. I think you add... Yeah, you add Blight to your starting area has 3 presence and 2 Blight. Now that Blight doesn't come off of the Blighted Island card because it's placed during setup, so at least there's that. But so you have like basically a stronghold. You have a whole bunch of presence and then 2 Blight on one place. If that starting place happens to have an Explorer on it, then you can actually have a very strong first turn if you just play something with a leaf on it, because you get to deal 1 damage to the Explorer where you place your presence, 1 damage to the Explorer in your starting space, take out 2 Explorers, plus get your card effect is a really powerful first turn. Obviously, there's a fair bit of RNG on that one because the initial Explorer has to go into whatever land you started on, which I guess is the highest numbered sands. Yeah. So if they explore into sands, you can do that. Otherwise, you can't. But of course, it's possible that whatever spirit you're playing with will be able to push an explorer into that land, although this is fast, so they'd have to be able to do it fast. But things could occur. You can also, in theory, do the power card presence on the first turn. It's not a shameful thing to do at all. It looks to me like the way I've always built Heart of the Wildfire is going up this track first, because it sucks so much to have 1 card play. Like, I just hate having 1 card play. So the way I've always grown with this spirit is to go up this track first. Whenever you go up a high card play number, low passive energy generation track, you're looking at wanting to have a bunch of minor powers to play. Your reclaim option is pretty forgettable, so gaining power cards to delay having to reclaim is pretty good. If you're gaining a bunch of minors, you don't need to do this all the time unless you want to play one of these 2-cost powers on the first turn. There's no particular need to do this on the first turn. So that gives you a 3-range presence add rather than a 1-range presence add, which, given that you want to put it in a land with a lone explorer, is pretty important. So basically, you're always going to have 1 card play on turn 1. I think you probably want to get up to 2 card plays on turn 2 pretty much every game. I have trouble imagining why you'd want to spend 2 turns getting up to passive energy generation on a spirit with this growth option, rather than spending 2 turns getting up to 2 card plays. It feels really difficult for me to believe that you'd want to do that. Especially because if you want to upgrade this, or if you want to do really much of anything with these powers, you need to get at least 2 and ideally 3 card plays, because the only element you easily get off your track is fire. You can get a plant up here, but you're going to grow into this thing, and then you've got your second plant, which only really unlocks this before you get your second card play. Just get your extra plant plays off of playing extra cards. It's way better. Anyway, those are the growth options and the presence tracks. They're pretty good. I don't love that it's so that it feels to me so obvious what to do early on, but a lot of Spirit Islands spirits work that way, and, still, it's not a major disaster. I do think you pretty much want to do these 3 first all the time, and then you think about whether you want to go for a 4th card play or start getting passive energy. I think I'd probably be inclined to just clear this track off entirely before doing this one and lean on this to make me energy. But there's also something to be said, actually, for just once you're going to get your 2nd fire, just embrace getting as much fire off the track as you can to maximize this and this. And then, well, it doesn't really maximize this, but maximize this and this. And so go like these 4, this one, and then either get the 4th card play or the energy play. Obviously, yet again, this is another spirit that benefits a whole lot from having Spread of Rampant Green around to get it extra growths, or some of the rare powers from the deck that allow you to get extra growths, both because filling up your tracks is always good, but if Spread of Rampant Green or Indomitable Claim or something happens, you also get a Blazing Presence trigger, which obviously it's awkward that it places Blight, but if you don't want to be placing Blight and doing damage for free when you play stuff, just don't play this spirit. So this is good. You should be able to engineer it so that this is good for you, which means getting more options to do it is going to be even better. So Firestorm, we sort of talked about in conjunction with setting up the first turn, but Firestorm does basically probably 1 damage early on. Now, unlike these, this is not just counting the fire on the track, so you will probably get 1 damage pretty much all the time. All your starting cards have fire on them. It can only target a blighted land where you have presence, which one of the arguments for turning on... I forgot to mention, I could imagine a universe where you're so well prepared to deal with Blazing Presence adding Blight that you actually just want to go 1, 2, 3 and turn on Blazing Presence's ability to take out houses and add Blight as soon as possible. One advantage of that is that this power gets vastly better once you're automatically placing a Blight whenever Blazing Presence triggers, because then wherever you just placed the thing, you can then pile on additional damage with Firestorm. So, there's an Explorer in a village somewhere because they just built, you plop down the Presence, blow up the village, you plop down this, you blow up the Explorer. Maybe that's not very important because the Explorer is not very dangerous on its own, but there are 2 Explorers, or there aren't any Dahan there or something, fine. Or even there are 2 villages and you have 4 fire. Getting up to 4 fire is not that hard once you get 2 off the track and 2 card plays. You just get it. So that's good. Then if you have 3 planned, you get to double the damage to 1 per fire. This is a lot of damage. Like, realistically, you're talking about you Blazing Presence in, you do 2 damage. You activate this thing, you have at least 2 fire off the track. You're talking about at least 3, maybe 4 damage. You drop 6 damage on a place. That turns a budding problem spot into just everything is dead. That's legit. You obviously have some targeting problems in the early game. You have the general problem that you're spreading Blight all over the place. But as I said, the payoffs are good, and it's fast, too. So you can just sort of be looking at a problem spot and be like, that's nice, I'm going to pick my growth option, I'm going to put a presence there, I'm going to play some cards, I'm going to clear up a 6 to 7 damage problem spot without using a single card play on it. That's really efficient. Really very good. Yeah. So then if you get 4 fire, 2 air. The 4 fire is probably a gimme once you get into the mid-game, but the 2 air can be sort of problematic. Only your expensive starting cards have air. Then you can split the damage between the target land and any number of your lands with Blight. So basically you can spread it around among all your lands that have both Blight and Presence. Obviously, that's great for cleaning up and stuff like that. Feels to me like you only really want to prioritize this ability if you're going up against one of the invaders that spits out a whole bunch of extra explorers or something like that, but it's certainly nice to have when you'll probably find a use for it when you can get it. And then if you can get to 7 fire in a land with a blight where you have presence, push all invaders, push all Dahan, destroy all invaders, add a blight. You know, this will always cause a cascade because you have to already have presence in a land with blight. I don't think I've used this a lot, primarily just because even for this spirit, 7 fire's a lot, right? You can get 4 off of the tracks, maybe, probably only if Spread of Rampant Green is helping you out with growing. And so then you need to have 3 card plays, you need to play 3 fire cards rather than getting lured away by good cards out of the deck that don't have that element. It might happen. Obviously, if it happens, you're probably pretty happy unless the Blight Cascade is literally going to kill you because you get to destroy all invaders, and whenever you get to destroy all invaders, you're happy, so that's fine. And then over here we have the burned land regrows, which is the whole, like, wildfires are often good for ecosystems, etc., etc. And so this lets you sort of clean up after yourself. 4 fire, 1 plant is going to be generally the kind of thing you can do starting in the mid-game. You know, once you have 2 card plays, and this is another reason you might want to grow like this, take this little, the 2 card plays and then get that fire, because, you know, you've got plant on 3 out of your 4 starting cards. You're probably going to have a fair number of turns where you get 4 fire, 1 plant without even really trying, and because you start with 2 blight on your starting board in the highest numbered sands, your first use of this, you just get to pick a blight up off the board and add it back to the card, which is going to be important because you're just vomiting it all over the stupid island. If you get 2 plant, which again, this is barely any harder, with this one, you get to remove a blight even if there are not 2 or more blight there. Obviously, this is a little complicated because once you remove the last blight from land, you can't target it with Firestorm anymore, but you know, generally the play pattern is going to be you grow into a land, you do a bunch of damage there with Firestorm and Blazing Presence, now there's nothing there, okay, we might as well pick up the blight we just put there to delay Blighted Island and or death because, like, now everything there's dead, why do I need to target it with Firestorm? And then if you get to 5/2/2, the problem with this one is you have to get you don't have any source of earth off of your starting cards or your board, right? So if you want to do this, then you need to have gotten 2 earth sources from cards you picked up, probably without them not being, probably with few of them, most of them need to be earth, fire, plant, which is not an unheard of combination, but I mean, earth plant comes together quite frequently. Fire's a little more complicated. Or, obviously, you get fed elements by someone else using the various ways you can do that. That removes 2 blights. Pretty good. Especially reasonable if you're... It's not unreasonable to be able to target both of these in one turn, in which case you destroy all invaders in a land, you get a blight cascade, but then you immediately take 2 blight off the board in the slow phase, so you're actually breaking even on total blight on the board, and you just destroyed all invaders in a land, which is obviously something you would like to be doing. The real limitation on this one, of course, is that you'll probably be using this early on to try to desperately stave off just having too much blight happening, which means you're going to be relatively short by the time you get to this point on lands that actually contain 2 blight tokens, because you will have cleaned up the second one so frequently with this one. But anyway, this is obviously just a good ability. It lets you... My experience has been that attempting to use the burned land regrows to stave off actually going into Blighted Island is kind of a mug's game, especially at higher levels of invaders. It's just not realistic. You just sort of embrace the Blighted Island effect. Obviously, if you can hold it off for even a turn, then in this version of the game, that's always good because there are no Blighted Island cards that are good for you in this version. That's different if you're playing the tabletop, where there are a ton of different Blighted Island cards that you can flip into, some of which are actually advantageous for the player. I think I haven't gone through and done the math, but I think even with both expansions, under half of the cards are good for you, so you're still better off statistically delaying going into Blighted Island. But anyway, you probably won't be able to have Heart of the Wildfire in a game and not have the island get blighted at some point. On the other hand, this can potentially delay that for an important turn before you have to start dealing with it, and obviously, once you get into Blighted Island, you need to actually not just die, and this helps a lot with that. So, in terms of the cards, we got Flame's Fury. Gives a spirit 1 energy. It has both of your early game elements on it. Target spirit does +1 damage with each damage dealing power they use this turn. That does +1 total damage with Firestorm, which is nice. This is a special rule, not a power, and anyway, you can't get this to resolve before this does, so there's no combo there, but it's good with this. And then, obviously, it can be... I believe this just increases the printed damage number by... wait, hold on. Yeah. No, this works like the Badlands do from the new expansion. So it does 1 extra damage total. Although if you get to repeat the power, you get to keep the boost. So this is not incredible on the say, Lightning Swift Strike power that does 1 damage to each invader. It's good, because it'll do 1 damage to each and then an additional 1 to one of them. But it doesn't just, like, clear out every village and explorer in the land, sadly. It is very good on... I can't remember whether there are any small but repeatable damage powers in this version of the game yet, but there are definitely some that exist, and it's quite good with that because of the repeated powers getting the extra boost. It's also +1 damage with each damage dealing power. So if you've got, like, Flame's Fury, you've got your own damage dealing power here, plus you can get them out of the deck, you can potentially team it up, right? Like, you targeting yourself is pretty reasonable anyway because you're not going to unlock your energy track very quickly. So then, like, you get +1 damage with this, you get +1 damage with flash fires, etc. I don't actually know whether this counts as a damage dealing power if you only have 1 fire, but it doesn't actually matter because it's not possible to play Flame's Fury and only have 1 fire, so I guess it doesn't come up. Anyway, this is a good card. It's a nice tool to have. It definitely makes a difference. It does have the downside that it takes you at least 3 turns to be able to play 3 cards, 4 if you go onto the fire thing, unless you're ramping somehow. So it takes a while before you can really start comboing this just because it takes you a while to get the card plays. Obviously, it's okay on turn 1. There's... If you happen to have started with a house in your initial sands, then being able to just blow it up on turn 1 for free by playing Flame Fury, right? You blow up an Explorer with Blazing Presence, you get +1 energy and blow up the village with Flame Fury. That's an above average first turn. So it can happen, but generally you're talking about a turn 2 player later. Threatening Flames... targets land with Blight and Invaders at range 0. So basically, it has to have your presence and Invaders and Blight. So what you might call awkward targeting restrictions. That said, 2 fear, and you push 1 village or explorer per territory from the land to an adjacent land without your presence. So they run away from the fire and don't go into a land with more fire. Or you get +2 fear if there's nowhere you can push them. Again, I always like 0-cost cards that can prevent a build, and this is a 0-cost card that can prevent a build. It gets really awkward to use really quickly because once you've got Blazing Presence on 2, your presence placement gets so dangerous that there just often are not going to be, that the invaders will just die when you place there. But you can sometimes have the setup where you have, like, both a village and an explorer in a land, and then you place the presence and blow up the village, and you push out the explorer, and they don't get to build. Things like that. It definitely comes up. And obviously, if you use this particularly cleverly, you might end up wanting or being able to delay getting Blazing Presence to 2 for a little bit longer, which can be nice since plays less Blight. So there's that. Asphyxiating Smoke. This has the downside of needing to be targeted from one of your places of power. That's really awkward because once this is placing Blight, placing presence where you already have it gets intensely uncomfortable. It always causes a blight cascade. Probably everything's already there, dead there, because your presence is so toxic. You can sort of mitigate it by picking up the blight with burned land regrows. Then you can put another blight down there, etc., etc., etc. This doesn't technically have to be targeted from a place with blight either, so you could potentially clean up all the blight and still target out of it. But this is often one of the ones I replace with a major when I get to it, just because you're likely only to have your starting place of power for a long time, both because the cascades suck when you double stack, but also because none of your other things care about places of power, and the fact that this causes your presence to do damage when you place it really incentivizes you to place it where you don't already have presence, because again, what's likely to happen is the places where you place presence early, everything dies, and so you don't need to place a second presence there. What you want to do is place it where there's an explorer you can kill or a village you can kill or whatever. That said, it's create a fear, destroy a house, push a Dahan. 2 energy is a little bit rough. This is a pretty good turn 1 play because you get good range from it off of your starting thing. You can let the initial explorer build a house and then just push the house out, and that prevents a ravage, which is nice. It gives you some Dahan shifting. Again, it's sort of nice that this has all 3 of the relevant elements you might want, but I don't love these cards like this that do 3 things for 2 energy, of which you probably only care about 1. Like, you really probably only care about destroying the house in the early game, when this is going to be best. Pushing the Dahan might get some value. There's nothing wrong with 1 fear, but it's a slow and awkward card. Pretty easy to replace. That said, if you're under a lot of pressure on turn 1, and you're willing to use, and you don't need a range 3 presence place, you can do this growth on turn 1, play this. Best case scenario there, you're taking out an explorer on your initial place with this, you're taking out another explorer wherever you place this, then you're letting a 3rd explorer build and still pushing out the thing. In that kind of magical Christmas land scenario, which can come up with some of the invaders that do extra stuff or whatever, you're preventing 3 ravages on turn 2. You're preventing basically 2 builds and therefore ravages, and then preventing a 3rd ravage by pushing out a house. That's a very powerful thing to do on turn 1 and buys you a lot of time to make up for the fact that you're costing yourself time by letting everything on fire. Definitely a card that can come up. Definitely a card that's, in my mind, high priority for replacement. Finally, we have Flash Fires. Range 1, target any land. Pretty good compared to your other stuff, which is very low range and finicky on targeting. Becomes fast if you have 2 air, which it seems unlikely to me you're going to play Flash Fires plus Asphyxiating Smoke very often early on, but this can become obviously very important with cards out of the upgrade deck, out of the minor or major power decks. Once you have 3 card plays, if you get 2 air, you play Flame's Fury, you play Flash Fires, suddenly you've got good range on a 2 damage fast power. It's pretty nice, In general, you want to team Flame's Fury up with Flash Fires. Once you can do that, it sort of makes this look silly too, because this targets so much better. If you don't care about pushing the Dahan, you'd pretty much always rather do this plus this than do Asphyxiating Smoke. Just generally going to be preferable. My pick for the 2 that I would replace first is these 2, and I think I'd replace this one first. But they're all fine, useful cards in the early game, which is more than a lot of spirits, which means you aren't going to end up, most likely, in that awkward spot where you end up wanting to do your mediocre reclaim option before you've really run out your starting deck, because there are cards in your starting deck that are just so bad. So that's good. Okay, that is, I believe, the stuff I had to say for this. Nothing I really forgot. Yep. My feeling is that Heart of the Wildfire is a pretty decidedly mid-tier spirit. It's definitely fun. It's one of my favorite kind of Spirit Island spirits, which is to say one where you really want to think about what other spirits it's going to work well with, what spirits it's going to work poorly with, what invaders it's going to work well with or against, etc., etc. That said, because it's got... And in the best case scenarios, it just feels really good. Like, you get those turns where the person on the other side, your other spirit is like, oh no, we've got so many problem areas, what can I possibly do about this? And you're just like, well, I'm going to blow this up by placing my presence there, and then I'm going to wildfire into some... And then I'm going to use my firestorm into somewhere else, and then I'm going to just like Flames Fury plus flash fires it fast and blow something else up, and oh, I've still got another card play or whatever. You know, you get to do a lot with very little in terms of card plays, which means you get a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can pick out of the starting deck. The only trick is that you really want to prioritize getting these plant symbols, because you generally have good access to fire just off the card, but you really want to get one plant almost every single turn of cards you play, and you'd really like to get 2 for things like removing blight from your lands. Ideally, even 3 makes this a lot better. So plant is going to be despite having tons of high fire numbers on the card, plant is going to be your number one priority for card pickups. The good news is the plant element cards tend to be pretty good and tend to be pretty flexible about what they do, so you can get a lot of neat stuff going on. Yeah, I'd give Heart of the Wildfire something like B tier, but it's very fun, so it's definitely a good addition to the game. Then we have Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island, one of the weirdest spirits that exists. Probably, I would say, almost certainly the weirdest spirit before the newest expansion, Jagged Earth, which has some real wonky ones in it. Like the star one that has like 8 different growth tracks at least, whatever. But Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island. So as we can see, it's got this interesting growth track that crosses over like an X. And I believe it's... No, it's only rated at high complexity. There are some very high complexity spirits in Jagged Earth, and some of them certainly deserve it and melt my brain. This one is merely high. It could go either way, but I would say it's a little bit more complicated than Ocean and whatever the big fear one is, Bringer of Dreams and Nightmares. I think that's it. Anyway, the 2 high complexities from the base game, I would consider it a step up even over that. The game basically says that it's got a bunch of utility and defense. That's broadly true, but the most accurate description I ever heard of the Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island is that it's a hyper carry, which is to say, well, a support that turns into a hyper carry. So the general play pattern, which I'll just go over first because it's going to inform how we look at all the other stuff, is generally, until you get all 7 of these growth options off the board, you are going to be stalling and playing for time. And then once you clear this on your next growth turn, you unlock this or this, and suddenly you just start really causing... You probably unlock this followed by this, but you really start going off and just causing a whole lot of damage and becoming extremely powerful. That means I am contractually obliged to point out that if you are running some Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island and you have any interest at all in optimizing your team, you just have to put a spread of Rampant Green on it, which I think a spread of Rampant Green... It's hard to call anything a mistake in Spirit Island just because it's not a competitive game, right? And so, like, if you think something is so powerful that it makes the game less interesting, you just don't have to interact with it. That said, Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island is one of the top contenders for really revealing how impactful Spread of Rampant Green's ability to give extra growths to other people on the board is on the game. Because on its own, there is no way for the Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island to place more than 1 presence a turn barring getting one of the very rare powers that allows it to do that, which means it takes a long, long, long time to grow up into the truly world-destroying levels. You know, you're talking about your 8th growth option in order to get there. With Spread of Rampant Green, you can get an extra... If you're really willing to prioritize it, you can give Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island an extra growth every other turn, or maybe even more often, depending on what else is going on the board. That's taking it from, turn 8, which is... A lot can go really badly wrong by turn 8. It's taking it from that to, okay, we're going to go on Serpent go-off times starting on, maybe turn 5, turn 4. I don't know. One of my customers who plays Spirit Island a bunch, who's a friend of mine, does a bunch of Spirit Island, openings, ideal opening type things, which I've never gotten into the weeds of doing that myself, although it's certainly helpful. I'm sure he knows. But you can gain a lot of extra turns on getting this thing up and going by involving Spread of Rampant Green, and probably even more if you involve other spirits that can play support for it and things like that. At least until Jagged Earth, Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island was the best spirit to really invest a team around building to maximize. Now, they did try to control this to a certain extent with the Deep Slumber rule, which is to say you can't have more than 5 presence on the island to begin with. And you start with 1. So basically, before you run into trouble, you can get about halfway to the ideal point, and then you get into trouble. In order to raise it, you have to use your Absorb Essence power card. Absorb Essence does various things, but the important part is that you pick up another spirit's presence from the board and you put it on here. And it is lost forever. You do give the spirit an element and an energy when you do that, which can be handy. And then as you cover these up, the number of presence you're allowed to have on the board goes up. The key number, again, is 8. I mean, you'd sort of like to get up to 9, but my experience is that you're generally good enough on energy off of the growth option here, or off of your friend giving it to you, or the fact that you get energy when you play Absorb Essence or whatever. You can get by with just 8, because it's 7 to get this. This requires growth preceding spaces. You can't pick this up until you've cleared out all 6 of these before it. Generally, this is about the point where you start going bonkers, because you start getting some of these really... you can start turning on some of this stuff. Obviously, getting any... all of these are just some of the most high-impact spaces in the entire game, so you're always happy to have more, but it gets to the point where you're like, okay, I need to weave Absorb Essences into my card plays in order to make this work. Maybe it's not worth it. I think you're generally looking at absorbing presence about 3 times during the course of the game. You could maybe get away with 2. More than 3, I mean, with 10, you can get both of these amazingly good spots and either 5 card plays, reclaim 1 if you've got a bunch of good minors, or the any element if you've got a bunch of good majors and you just want to start going off with these. So maybe you want 10, maybe you want 11 to get this. I've never seen a game where I've been like, 6 energy per turn with an option for 4 energy off of the growth. Notice you get to pick 2. So it's not as bad as it looks. You don't pick that and do nothing else. You pick that in addition to one of the other things. 10 energy on a turn if I need it. Do I really need to go up to 16? Generally not. Maybe sometimes. But especially because you've got to invest so much more to get there and allowing you to unlock the full track and all that good stuff. The other interesting thing about this rule that's not at all obvious is you can turbo game it because you are limited to 5 presence on the island, which means if you team up with someone like the Wildfire Spirit we just talked about, who's going to light your presence on fire, you actually don't have to ever absorb essence. Like, having 5... There's nothing in this spirit's basic repertoire that cares about having a bunch of presence on the board. You don't even have anything basically that cares about places of power. You can actually get through a game just fine with only 5 presence on the board, assuming that you're able to get up these tracks anyway because the presence gets destroyed. So the Serpent can actually get a lot of mileage out of intentionally letting its presence get taken off of the board if you're willing to do that kinds of brinksmanship, which means that it's suddenly a weirdly effective combination with the Wildfire, because it might want the Wildfire to place a presence into a land with one of its energies just to light that presence on fire, which is sort of cool. Also not all that obvious when you just look at it, but it's definitely something worth remembering. If you're planning to do something like that, you certainly never need to absorb more than 1 essence. You might end up doing it anyway, just because the Absorb Essence card is actually a pretty reasonable card to play if you don't have anything else going on for the turn. It's got good elements. It makes you a net energy for playing it. The spirit gets some energy and elements. Like, it's not like you're just wasting time when you absorb essence. You actually accomplish things. But that said, you don't want to force your hand, and what you really don't want to do is fail to play absorb essence, not notice that you aren't going to be able to grow, and then not be able to place your presence and miss out on one of those critical growths towards your things. The other thing worth noting about this is that the way it works in terms of putting pressure on your friend's presence means that it gets even better with Spread of Rampant Green than just the ability of Spread of Rampant Green to accelerate this nonsense makes it, because Spread of Rampant Green does not care at all if you eat some of its presence. Not only does it get to grow itself all over the place very quickly, basically for free, it also gets to replay destroyed presence, which it can't replay these, but that just means that it'll never run out of presence. You're sort of capping how many places it can be on the board, but it's really not a very big deal. Whereas someone like Vital Strength of the Earth, right? Vital Strength of the Earth suffers terribly for every one of its essence that you eat, because it's incredibly slow to get presence onto the board and really cares about having places of power. And so it's very difficult to team up the Serpent with someone like Vital Strength of the Earth, because you just can't afford to get too much of your presence eaten. So if you're doing that, you have to try to manage the Serpent's deep slumber ability by getting its presence destroyed by Blight, basically. Which is doable, but it makes for a very different kind of game, and you really want to be thinking about that from very early on in the game, because it's great to get an early presence blown up by getting blighted when you can pretty easily deal with the stuff that's going to be lurking around there. When you're in the mid to late game and there are a bunch of problem areas, you don't necessarily want to be in the position of saying, oh, well, we have to leave this problem area alone for this turn, even though we could deal with it, because I need to get one of my presence off the board, right? That's not so good. Weirdly enough, this also means that Serpent slumbering beneath the island can be happier taking some of the cards that add blight to the island than other spirits are, because you can use those to tactically remove your own presence from the island to allow you to keep growing without having to play Absorb Essence. Okay, so let's look at what actually happens when you start growing. Basically, the energy per turn side of the track. So I'm going to talk about things on both sides of this breakpoint, because there's not really much to talk about over here. Once you get past the breakpoint, every single node is great. You're happy to have any of them. You just get to start getting incredible power. Before you get to it, as always, you're just going to go here first, because you need 2 card plays per turn as quickly as possible. Then I like growing up to the Reclaim 1 next, because Reclaim 1 is nice. Your Reclaim, you do get to do something else when you Reclaim, which is nice, because that means you get to grow every single turn. But, you know, obviously you would rather gain a power card and an energy or 4 energy than have to do this. So the Reclaim one delays you having to use this one. The Move a Presence, it's fine, but it's pretty sus. It's okay, but you're not excited about anything on this banner, and you generally are going to be excited about one of these two. Particularly once you get to the Reclaim 1, if you've been gaining power cards a fair bit, which is broadly reasonable, then, because this is your only way to gain power cards, right, is by picking this one. You really, let's just talk about the growth options for a little bit. You really, 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 really have to use this one every single turn. Like, honestly, this could be written much more like the Spread of Rampant Green, where it says always do this and pick one of these, because until you get to this spot, your number one priority has to be clearing off this spot. And once you clear off this spot, every growth gives you turbo mega power, so then you want to grow every turn too. This does only get to add your presence to a land without blight, which makes the plan where you use blight to remove your presence significantly more awkward. Ditto with the Wildfire matchup. That said, it's not generally a disaster. It just means that you want to have a sort of a checkerboard where you don't have big areas of blight. As we'll see when we get to the basic cards, most of your stuff has pretty good range. This one, obviously, is the exception. But by the time you're really going to get seriously boxed in by adding a little bit of blight, you'll probably have options for cleaning it up. But that is a downside of the aggressively used blight strategy, is that anywhere where you let your presence get burned by a blight, you can't go back there until you get to clean it up. You can also, of course, manage this, because you don't have anything that requires a place of power, you can also manage this by, if you know you're going to lose a presence somewhere due to adding a blight there, just add a second presence there first, so that once you lose one, you've still got another one. That can be a pretty solid thing to do. This is definitely a spirit that rewards foresight, particularly if you are trying to get away with not using Absorb Essence all that much in order to game this. The other option, of course, which I forgot to mention but is really important, until more expansions come to PC Spirit Island, you can just go with a strategy where you just let the island become blighted quite quickly. Because the 2 Blighted Island cards, right, one of them automatically destroys one of your presence every turn. The other one gives you an option to forget a power or lose a presence every turn. Either way, once you've gone into Blighted Island, unless you're getting multiple plays off the track per turn, you suddenly don't have to worry about this anymore. You just pick up a presence every turn to the Blighted Island effect, and then you replace it with this, and this basically breaks you out of needing to care about this, because you're just always going to keep up. Now, the downside of that, of course, is that at that point, you're locked into however much presence you had on the island when it started, which means if you start losing presence to blight that you didn't want to lose, you can end up really uncomfortably low on total presence on the island. But because you can gain a power card every single turn, and there aren't that many major powers in the game yet, you will pretty quickly dig your way into Blazing Resurgence or something like that, which means that you can recover from that. Blazing Resurgence or Indomitable Claim, which means you can potentially recover from that. It's another case where I haven't done the math, but it might make sense. I sort of wonder whether you just want to gain major powers starting from turn 1, because if you hit Indomitable Claim, it's just so powerful. I don't know how many gain power cards you'd really have to go through for that, and obviously at 1 energy per turn, like, basically, that would be an interesting strategy to try, and I need to math it out, but basically the strategy would be you gain power cards until you hit Indomitable Claim, and then you start gaining 4 energy, which covers the Indomitable Claim every turn. It feels like if you're going to do something like that, you might as well just team up with Spread of Rampant Green, but it's worth thinking about. Anyway, so these are all pretty bad spaces. the best you can actually get in terms of raw resources before you hit the break point is you get 2 card plays a turn, 1 energy per turn, and a bunch of random elements. The bunch of random and reclaim 1. The bunch of random elements are definitely relevant. You've got these powers that do things with bunches of random elements. Fine. And obviously you can start kicking your major power cards and things like that. But by and large, you don't get a lot more powerful once you've unlocked this spot. And, this spot and this spot are the 2 big ones before you start going off. And all of the rest matter, but I don't think they matter enough that it's not worth always taking this one and then these 3. I have trouble believing that, turning on this all the time is worth growing here and delaying the reclaim 1 by a turn. Anyway, and then, as I said, after that, you just get to go off. So what happens once you start going off? Mostly what happens is that you just start, you're reclaiming 1 every turn. Maybe you get to where you're reclaiming 2 every turn. So you can just play your best power or 2 powers every single turn, even without having to use the reclaim, which, again, is no huge deal because you can use the reclaim and still get 4 energy or still add a presence if you have plays left or still gain a power card or whatever. So once you've unlocked this and maybe this, you basically get into a pretty repetitive game state unless you happen to have powers you don't like and want to gain more, where you're just playing several of your best power cards every turn. You might be triggering this thing every turn to get you yet more diversity, but you're mostly just spamming out probably 1 or 2 really powerful major powers and getting good levels of this too. This one, I did forget that you could, and should have mentioned earlier that you can actually ramp yourself. It's difficult to arrange, but if you're on the verge of being able to hit this, that might be a reason to pick to unlock the water before going up this side, because, you might want to go water earth, because really the only realistic way to get this early enough to matter is to turbo up to the earth there, and then have a way to play 2 earth, 1 plant, 1 water out of 2 cards, which you can't do with just your starting cards because you have no plant to start with. And you don't get any plant until you get to this any. Yeah, it looks to me like it's going to be hard to rush this, but if you get, a couple of earth plant picks off of your early power card gains, it's worth thinking about whether you want to readjust to try to get to this, because obviously this is very good once you can start triggering it. I don't know whether you're better. I don't know whether you're more likely to hit this earlier. I don't know whether you're better, what your odds are on hitting this early with minor powers versus your odds on hitting Indomitable Claim with major powers. That might be worth sitting down and mathing out at some point. I'm not going to do it right now, but it's worth thinking about. Anyway, so Serpent Wakes in Power is the sort of the support thing that you tend to get early on. Once you get a plant, minor power, or get to this any slot, then you can generally get this pretty much all the time. This gives you an energy and also rewards you for absorbing essence by giving anyone else who you've absorbed gets energy, so that's fine. This is the big one, obviously, the ramp one, and then gain a major power without forgetting other spirits with 3 or more absorbed presence may do likewise. Sure, why not? On the other hand, it is very, very difficult to actually cause this to happen. Is it even possible? Yeah, because you get a fire off of here. So theoretically, you could get this to happen before you get your 4th card play, but realistically, this is something that happens once you unlock some of this stuff. And that means that once that happens, you very rapidly get the whatever major powers it is are going to be most helpful. And so then this is Serpent Rouses in Anger, which is the sort of I am actually a serpent that is also the island, and now I am just going to throw you off, which is very good flavor. For each fire and earth you have, you deal 1 damage to buildings. So pretty... The real bottleneck on this one, is, on both of these, is that you can't get this earth very early. I guess going to this any... Yeah, I mean, the big bottleneck on this one is, you could start doing this one early if you went up here, but you're probably looking at doing this with card plays, but you don't actually... Yeah, okay, so you could do absorb plus... You can get it off of 2 card plays with your starting cards if that ends up being something that makes sense. And at 2, it'll blow up a village, and that's pretty good. Range 0 is obviously a bummer if you're doing the thing where you're actively destroying your own presence one way or another in order to try to get around having to absorb stuff. Still manageable, but worth noting. Then... The other option is, now keep in mind with all of these all stack up, but they have weirdly different element requirements, right? So if you have 2 fire, 2 water, 2 plant, 3 earth, you get both gain the energy and give energy and ramp and give ramp. And obviously once you get to the point where you can do this, you get all 3. If you're reliably getting all 3 on Serpent Wakes in power, then unless you're dying very quickly, you and your friends are gaining so much power from this that you're going to win off of it very quickly. And so one of the ways that you can just quickly take over the game once you get to unlock some of this stuff is to just do this every turn. Because it doesn't really accomplish all that much on the turn you do it, but it gives so many miscellaneous benefits to everyone else on the board that if you do it more than once or twice, the game becomes unlosable. The other big thing you can do, other than just dropping major powers all over the place, which is also generally a good strategy, is you can get up to like this apocalypse version of Serpent Rouses in Anger, which just does a bunch of damage in every land in the game. Obviously 7 is a lot of cost. On the other hand, if you have this unlocked and you use the 4 energy growth, you're making 10 energy just off of that, so you're netting 3 energy over doing this. And again, you do... It's X is the number of presence you have in and adjacent to that land. Obviously, that might not be a large number if you've been picking them up to get around this, but even so, you're talking about probably minimum 3 in most lands in the game, going up potentially to 4 or 5. It doesn't take very long of doing 5 damage everywhere, doing 3 to 5 damage everywhere before just nothing survives. And then for this one, you make fear and you can push stuff around, which is fine. This is like, again, if you get this, you also get both of these at a very high level, which means, so if you have exactly 5, 6, 6, then you get to do 6 damage to buildings in lands you control. Then you get... in a land you control, then you get to push up to 2 surviving villages out of that land and make some fear, and you can push them into lands where they're likely to get finished off by this. You just get to do... Once you get to do this or this, that's effectively a victory condition, even aside from the fact that you're probably also dropping a bunch of major powers. It's hard to really describe, but I've never had a game where you get to unlocking both of these, or even often just this one, where the Serpent doesn't just immediately start taking over the game in such a way that it rapidly becomes impossible to lose. Obviously, the difficulty is that takes a long time unless you have Spread of Rampant Green involved. The other thing worth noting is that if Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island is on your team, you are heavily incentivized to take Elemental Boon, whatever the one is that feeds elements to your friend, because it's very difficult to hit this before you've unlocked most of this stuff if you have to rely on just your own cards you're playing. But if your friend can feed you 1 blue, 1 water, 1 earth, 1 plant, suddenly it's pretty easy to hit this. And if you're hitting this every turn, you're gaining a lot from that. Like, that is definitely worth 1 card play on your friend. So I don't love Serpent's effect on the game, and one of the reasons is that it sort of has the Where's Poochie problem, where, like, if someone if Serpent is Slumbering Beneath the Island is present in the game, everyone needs to be thinking about where do we get, what can we do to contribute to getting Serpent to the point where it will take over this game and instantly win. And I don't think it's a disaster. It's fine. Like, that's a fun thing to do sometimes, but it's so good at doing that I suspect if you really wanted to optimize Spirit Island with just the components that are in the computer game right now, you would start every team with Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island and Spread of Rampant Green and just go from there. And, it's fine. Again, there's no such thing as competitive Spirit Island. You play for fun, you play to challenge yourself. It's fine that there is a sort of an optimal thing to be doing, but for my money, I think Serpent Spread of Rampant Green is the optimal thing to be doing, again, in the version of the game that's currently on the computer. That maybe changes when you have more expansions and things like that. Okay, I've been going on for a while, which is fine. I've been gone for a while. But let's finish this up by looking at these. The Serpent starting cards. So we got Elemental Aegis. This is, I think, the most powerful defense card in any of the starting decks. I'm hard-pressed to think of any others. Defend 2 in target land and all adjacent lands. And also it gets better if you have presence on your Deep Slumber track. Fine, I guess. I mean, sure, yes, that's great. This card is this is a preposterous Spirit Island card. Really, really good. It is obviously limited a little bit by the fact that it has range 0, although that is significantly undermined by the fact that you've got a range 3 presence place that you will be using every single turn. So really, it's got something much more like range 3, because you're immediately going to place your presence, and then you're going to target, you can potentially target from where that presence started. So it's hard to overstate just how good this is. You get something like 7 lands hit with the Defend 2 with it, and it somehow scales up as the game goes on. So once Defend 2 stops being good, it's probably up to Defend 3 to 5. And that'll be good again. Defend 5 hitting 7 lands? Obviously, it's pretty unlikely they'll be ravaging all 7 lands at once, right? But you compare this to something like Encompassing Ward. Encompassing Ward is one of the best minor power defense cards in the game, especially if you're not facing one of the invaders that makes the that fundamentally changes how the defense math works. Defend 2 is a really good sweet spot to have, and getting it in a bunch of lands just means it's really likely that you get to solve a couple of problem lands at once, all for 1 energy, and you've got a pretty good mix of elements. Really, this is about as good as the mix of elements gets out of the starting deck, realistically, because until the relatively late game, you're much more excited about hitting targets on this thing than hitting targets on this thing, and it has fire, water, and earth, which hits all 3 of the targets on this that you can possibly hit out of your starting deck. This card is unreasonably good, and I think it's probably necessary that it's that good for the normal play for Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island, because you have to spend so long playing just support, and this is just defense support, and this is obviously an all-star defense support card. It unfortunately just becomes pretty unreasonable if you're doing the optimal thing and pairing up with Spread of Rampant Green, because it means that you've got a couple of turns of vulnerability, but Elemental Aegis protects like half the board for those turns. So yeah, there's that. Obviously a great card. Not really much to be said about it other than it's great. Gift of Flowing Power. Target spirit gains 1 energy. Has to target another spirit. I would not, side note, suggest playing Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island in a solo game. It just seems like asking for trouble. On multiple levels. You have no one to absorb essence from, so you have to get a bunch of your presence killed. Yeah, do not suggest playing solo Serpent. I'll just say that. So, Gift of Flowing Power, another spirit gains an energy. They may either play another power card or gain a fire and a water element. Yeah, fine. Worth noting, the play another power card by paying its cost thing does not make that card fast. So if they use that to get an extra slow card play, then they can't use it until the slow phase. It's not like you don't get to be like budget lightning, but it's still good. And a lot of spirits have perfectly reasonable zero-cost starting powers that they're always willing to weave in. You get a lot of elements from your starting powers, so this is a good culprit. This is a lot better than it looks. It's a good culprit for letting you hit element milestones before you have any business doing that, which can be obviously very powerful. Not being able to use it on yourself is really important, because otherwise it would be very good at letting you get like this earlier than you should, which just as well we can't. So there's that. Gift of the Primordial Deeps. Spirit gains a minor power. Also has to be another. You can't use this to ramp yourself. Then they can either play that power immediately, or they gain the elements. This one is less good just because when you set up Gift of Flowing Power, you know what you're going to do with it, right? Like, all the information's there on the board. This one has a big question mark, because if your friend can't really use Earth and or Moon elements, then, like, if they just whiff on the power, then it's like you paid one to give them a minor, which is fine, but they didn't really get much out of it. Obviously, it gets much better if you've got people teaming up with you who care about Moon and or Earth symbols. Ocean cares about those a lot and often has trouble getting Earth, so this can be good with it. But generally, I would describe these two powers as fitting the sort of dirtily middle phase. Like, they're both clearly, they're big culprits for why you end up playing a support early that then turns into this deadly hypercarry. They allow other people to do useful things, but they don't really allow you to do anything useful yourself, right? Unless you can get access to a plant, then this doesn't unlock, neither of them alone unlocks either of your things, right? Because this doesn't give you the fire to do this. I mean, I guess it sort of gets you towards the push, maybe. Like, if you play it with Absorb Essence, you get it towards the push. But you really, the turns where you play these things are turns where you're like, well, I hope this allows my friend to do something useful, because unless I also played Elemental Aegis, I'm not doing very much this turn. And then finally you have Absorb Essence. Yeah, I mean, the primary thing you do with it is absorb the essence, which is good both in terms of unlocking your stuff, but also good because it powers up Elemental Aegis and it powers up the ability to make this support better. So even if you're planning to primarily manage your Deep Slumber track by removing your presence, you're going to want to play Absorb Essence once or twice, just because, well, you're probably going to want to try to play Absorb Essence a minimum of once for each other spirit in the game, because having any absorbed, a spirit having any absorbed presence, suddenly they start to benefit from all the stuff happening on here. So your baseline minimum number of times you're going to want to try to play this is going to be, I would like to take one presence from each other player. Unless, if one of them is Vital Strength of the Earth, maybe you don't want to do that because it's Vital Strength of the Earth, but by and large, you're sort of, unless other things are going on, your plan is going to be, I'm going to absorb one presence from each other spirit, and then maybe I'll absorb more if I really need to, but it's okay if I just absorb once from each other spirit, and then I start getting my presence killed off in order to grow that way, or something like that. The good news about this is that you need, I don't know what's up with its energy cost. All your stuff is cheap, and you have a lot of passive energy gain, so it feels sort of like this could cost 0 and give you 1. But never mind. It effectively nets you 1 energy, it gives your friend 1 energy, it gives your friend 1 of any element, which, if you play Absorb Essence and Gift of Flowing Power on someone on the same turn, they suddenly get a whole additional, or Gift of the Primordial Deeps, although again it's harder to control because they don't know what kind of minor power they'll be able to play, right? With this one they have to immediately play the minor power they got. They can't just play any power. But you can do something sort of similar with it. But basically, if you give someone an extra card play with Gift of Flowing Power and 1 extra any element, there are a lot of spirits where that will unlock the mid to late game version of their of one of their innate powers far earlier than it would be otherwise possible, and that can be really, really strong. So that's a sort of a synergy to look out for. is if you're absorbing essence, you consider using gift on the same person so that they can really get a big elemental boost that turn, either for innate powers or some sort of, if they got an early major or something like that. Definitely worth remembering. Absorb Essence also obviously has your best elemental spread, although it still doesn't have any plant on it. So you really... That's the other thing. You basically, you want to decide early whether you're going to try to get plant cards really aggressively or whether you're just going to try to get whatever major powers they are and not get majors quickly and not worry about this so much. I'm definitely going to try to do a game with this spirit at some point, and maybe I'll just do one game each and see what happens. I don't know. I don't have any solid plans right now, again, just because the pandemic's thrown such a wrench into everything. But I am looking forward to showing these off and interested in doing so, so hopefully I'll be able to find the time and energy to do it pretty soon. I think I maybe sounded a little bit down on Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island. It's certainly worth having in your game. It's certainly worth playing a couple of times because it feels very different to play and is really incredibly powerful. I've had there are a couple of expansion spirits from further expansions that can do something similar in the late game where they really just like pop off. But this is the first one that does that, and it's a fun feeling to get a couple of times. So I definitely recommend taking it out for a test or two, especially with Spread of Rampant Green, just to really get a feel for what it does. That said, it does feel like a balance outlier insofar as it is so pivotally important to any team that involves it that I don't... I'll play any number of Thunderspeaker games. If someone just says, hey, we're going to sit down and play 5 games of Spirit Island in a row, you're designated Thunderspeaker, I'm like, heck yes, bring it on. If someone says, we're going to play 5 games of Spirit Island in a row, you're designated Serpent, I'm not going to say no, I love Spirit Island, but I'm not going to be excited. I'm going to be thinking, well, could I maybe not be Serpent all 5 times? Just because it tends to play out in a very similar way, where early in the game, it has very little that impacts the board, and late in the game, it just annihilates the board. Anyway, I do think that the Promo Spirit pack is a great addition to the game. You get Serpent, which does have the virtue that if you would like to go through the high-level stuff a first time to get a feel for it, doing a Serpent carry build can be a really good way to do that. And then once you get a feel for the higher levels of things, you can then say, okay, now let's challenge ourselves further by trying some other kind of build against this. And that, to me, is a big virtue of Spirit Island, is that you have ways to ease yourself into higher difficulty that allow you to not get frustrated by necessarily getting crushed by it over and over again, but that leave you with enough of a feel for it that you then can maybe decide what else you can do to take on those challenges. And Serpent Slumbering Beneath the Island is definitely a good component of that kind of thing. And I actually think, even though I am well noted as hating getting Blight on my island, I think Heart of the Wildfire is super cool and really a harbinger of the design philosophy that led to some of my favorite other spirits in the game, and gives you a lot to think about in terms of building teams with it, how to play it, how to adapt to different situations with it, and it only gets more like that as you get more content into the game that gives you more things that can potentially interact with it, more Blighted Island cards so that you have less predictability as to what happens when it lights half the island on fire. Things like that. So, yeah, my feeling is that they're both good additions to the game, and hopefully I will be showing them off in gameplay for you soon. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll be back before too long.